Welcome to Convince Me in 15 Minutes, where we give our guests 15 minutes to convince us about timely topics in the financial services industry. Before we begin, please subscribe below. The Convince Me in 15 Minutes podcast will introduce you to new concepts, theories, philosophies, and practices in the financial services industry. Your guides are Luke Tawas and Keith Thompson. We'll follow up the initial presentation with questions. So again, subscribe below and we'll introduce our guest speaker.
I'm Liz Strait. I'm currently the head of behavioral science at a fintech called Atlas Point. Before that, I was in academia for 14 years where I studied behavioral economics. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a finding from behavioral economics, and I'm going to convince you that the meaning of money matters. So when I say the meaning of money, I really mean how do people treat their own money? And there's a framework within behavioral economics called mental accounting. And I'm a little biased, but this is one of my favorite findings from behavioral economics because I think it has huge implications in terms of people's spending, saving, and their self-control around their monetary resources. So mental accounting is kind of what it sounds like. So if you think about traditional accounting, it's a form of that, but that people are using for their household income and their spending. So how do we know how people treat their money? Basically, we do it through observation. We're not like cutting open people's heads and looking for their little mental accounts. But there are three components to this framework that help us understand how people treat their money psychologically. So mental accounting considers how are outcomes perceived or experienced, which then leads into how do people make decisions around their money and how are those decisions evaluated. And that's interesting because it's both before the decision is made, during the decision, and then how they feel afterwards. So do they feel regret? Are they satisfied with the decision that they made? It also has to do with the assignment of different financial activities to specific accounts. So spending versus savings, or if people are more specific, like this is my entertainment budget versus my clothing budget. And then it also has to do with how frequently people evaluate their accounts. And this is actually what explains things like why people hold on to losing stocks and they're more likely to sell stocks that have gains. It's because they're thinking of each stock as an account. And as soon as that account goes in the red, they don't want to actually incur that loss. So they do what they can to avoid it. So one of the main findings from mental accounting is that all dollars are not created equal, which is in stark contrast to what economic theory would say. So a dollar should be a dollar and it should have the same value regardless of how it's used or how it's categorized. But what we find pretty universally is that people are not equally willing to spend from their different mental accounts. I think the best example is savings. A savings account is pretty much treated as sacred, and people are very hesitant to remove money from savings accounts versus other types of accounts. And this explains things like why people can have both savings and debt at the same time, which economic theory would say should not happen. And it can also explain why our spending decisions are not always optimal. So why we're not always maximizing our utility in terms of our spending or even our savings. So one of my other favorite findings, I'm pretty much just going to say all of this is my favorite, I'm now realizing, is that there are two components to utility. So that's the value we get out of something. So we buy things because they give us utility, they make us happy, we acquire a good that has value to us. And so that should be the only type of utility that matters. But there's actually this other type that we see, which is transaction utility, which is basically the value of the deal. So we'll buy something just because it's a really good deal, or we won't buy something just because we feel it's a ripoff. And this again means we may not be spending our money optimally. We're making a decision solely on our kind of feelings about what type of deal we're getting. And there are entire businesses built around transaction utility. So think like companies like Costco, IKEA, Groupon, any type of like discount retailer like Ross or Marshalls, they're all capitalizing on transaction utility. So the fact that people like getting a good deal beyond just the product that they're getting. People will also make decisions to not purchase. So an example would be at movie theaters, soda and candy is significantly marked up. And people may say, I'm not going to buy soda and candy at the movie theater because it's so expensive and that's a total ripoff, even though having that soda and candy at the movie might actually make them happier and maybe worth that additional cost. And people who are compulsive value seekers who really value transaction utility, they do probably the weirdest things. And I always think of the show Extreme Couponing, which I actually haven't watched a lot of, but I've seen enough to know that those people care a lot about transaction utility. The next two things I'm going to talk about are kind of opposite of what I was saying about the relationship between mental accounting and perhaps self-control via budgeting. But these are things that we actually use to justify spending more. And I find this interesting because I basically think of this as almost like mental gymnastics that we're doing to justify spending. So one of the main ways that we end up spending more than maybe we want to is something called decoupling. And this just means we take the act of payment away from the actual act of consumption. So perhaps the best example is paying with a credit card. So you pay with a credit card, but you don't pay off that balance until later. Some people pay it all off at once. Other people will hold that balance over time. But basically, you can consume in the moment, like you can have a really nice dinner at a restaurant, you can go on vacation, but you don't have to pay for it until later. And so that actual act of consumption feels better because we almost feel like we're getting it for free because the cost comes much later. So decoupling, as it's called, can happen via credit cards, but it can also happen via things that I would call almost like funny money. So like chips at a casino kind of separates the act of the purchase from the actual consumption and experience. Other things would be like all-inclusive vacations, unlimited phone plans. And then what's really relevant now are kind of these electronic payment methods. So things like Apple Pay, digital wallets, Venmo, all of those things really separate this kind of pain of payment from actual consumption. And so it's somewhat concerning in that this could explain why people are saving less or have more debt that they're carrying now than maybe they did in the past. Another way that we find to kind of spend more, or maybe even spend more beyond our awareness of this spending, is something called pennies a day. And this comes from sort of, if you think of those commercials where it's like a charity asking for a donation, they would say like, you can help an orphaned animal for just 5 pennies a day. And the idea behind that is that you're comparing the cost to a very small transaction. And for us, small transactions tend to go into kind of this untracked category where we're not adding up all of those small costs. We just think, oh, this is a small amount of money, so it's not a big deal. And so we fail to see how those small expenses add up. And so if companies can do pricing where they make the price very small, like $4 a month or pennies a day, they're more likely to get people to buy that product because it goes in this kind of small transaction, petty cash account. And so that kind of conventional advice you hear a lot where it's like, oh, cut out your morning Starbucks and you'll save a lot more. It's not really as ridiculous as it sounds sometimes. So a lot of times people are like, well, that's not going to make you save or change your financial situation drastically. I think why it's actually valuable advice is it tries to train you out of just making small purchases all the time and seeing how those small purchases can actually add up to something more significant than you probably realized.
So Liz, I took a look at your background and I believe you were held faculty positions at both Columbia University in their graduate school of business, as well as Colorado State. I have two kids in college. How would you talk to them versus somebody like Keith or myself that's been in the workforce for 20 years?
So I would definitely take an approach that's more trying to encourage self-control via these mental accounting principles. So I would expose them to the ideas of how, especially like electronic payment and digital wallets, can lead to increased spending, same with credit cards, and how understanding these psychological effects can actually help counteract maybe the temptation to spend more or spend via those methods. But I think really what's valuable to people who are in college and entering, quote unquote, the real world, where they are responsible for their own financial situation, is encouraging them to exhibit and practice self-control. And that is something where research has found a lot of self-control is like a muscle where you can actually build it up. And so I would probably encourage them from the start to think about a budget, set up a budget, and not to make it too rigid in terms of their spending, but just to exercise that self-control around financial decisions and prioritize things like saving for the future, which can be really hard for younger people because there's the allure of the now, like I could have this product now, versus savings for this future person I don't know and have no connection to. So I think I would be much more focused on the self-control budgeting side of mental accounting and the principles that go along with the framework.
And how does that compare to somebody like myself or Keith, who's been in the workforce for 20 to 30 years?
I would say that probably people who have had the experience of getting a paycheck, being responsible for their finances, they are going to have a much better sense of what mental accounting looks like for them. So the focus would be more on some of the biases and blind spots that might come out of having a mental accounting system for so long, because mental accounting can lead to a lot of rigidity in terms of spending. So you may have a hard time being more flexible or adaptive in terms of investment strategies or saving strategies. So I'd probably focus more on some of the negative effects of having a strict mental accounting system in terms of happiness and sort of future outcomes. I think that would be more of my focus.
It seems to me that there is a fine line between mental accounting and budgeting. I mean, when I first got married 1,000 years ago and we had no money, we literally would take envelopes and say, look, this is the mortgage money, this is the grocery money, this was the money that you had to go to the movie. It's not just mental accounting. It is, in fact, budgeting if you do mental accounting right, isn't it?
Yes. So budgeting does actually fall under mental accounting. The difference is some people just do it mentally. They kind of keep track, like, oh, I think I've spent about this much. And then there are other people at the other extreme who are much more kind of strict in their budgeting rules. I have heard a lot of people have they do envelope based budgeting, or they have jars even, or they just have a very specific way of inducing self-control around spending and tracking spending more carefully. So mental accounting captures that whole spectrum and budgeting falls under it. But again, there's a spectrum. So some people are very strict about their spending, others not as much. And so yes, it falls under that, but the idea is that there's still this kind of mental process in terms of categorization, tracking, labeling the money. I also find it really interesting when people do have these sort of physical separations, because I've heard anecdotes from people where they're like, oh, I have actual jars and my expense jar was empty, but my savings jar is full. And so I couldn't buy groceries this month. And it's like, but you had money. It just was in the wrong jar, right? And so it makes a lot of sense to them, and a lot of it is about psychological soothing and feeling good psychologically, but it doesn't always make sense when you look at it from the outside.
So my wife constantly tells me that I'm the kind of guy who will scour the internet to save 15 cents on something, but I've got no problem going out and buying a bottle of wine for $100. This concept of a deal is fascinating to me because people do love a deal. We like getting something for what we think is less than the perceived value. But there's a complete disconnect, it seems to me, as it relates to their behavior with investments. Nobody likes to buy stuff that is cheap in investments, but we have that behavior in our purchasing. Why is that there's such a disconnect?
That's such a good question, Keith. And it's something that I also think about a lot. So, for example, in another area too, it's like people would be pretty hesitant to buy like a deal, a really cheap deal on like LASIK eye surgery. There are just certain categories where the value of the deal is either irrelevant or actually detrimental to purchasing that product. And I think, that has a lot to just do with how we categorize things, how we think about things in terms of, is a value good here or is a value bad? We also have a very strong price quality heuristic, and this can vary by product category, where we think higher price means higher quality. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. Like if you think about Costco, a lot of the products that they put under their Kirkland Signature brand are actually manufactured by companies that are higher end but are willing to outsource the private labeling to Costco. So you could be buying the exact same vodka, but you're paying $50 for one bottle because it's the brand and $20 for the other because it's Kirkland Signature. So I think we do these sort of thought processes, again, this kind of mental gymnastics where we're evaluating products and how important this price quality heuristic is or that trade-off. And so we're unwilling to spend even though it's a good deal. And I think that's really interesting. And again, very category specific. And it might vary for different people in terms of the categories that they would define as sort of, I don't want a deal on that, right?
So I'll share with you one of the major changes that we've made in our household, which is I used to pay all the bills and I used to, want to control all of it. And it wasn't until something my brother-in-law said to me that really made me change my mind. And that was, we were at dinner one time, very expensive dinner, and my wife takes out her credit card and pays for the whole table. And my brother-in-law called the credit card 100% off coupon. It's just funny money. And it kind of hit me. I pay all the bills. My wife doesn't see the total amount at the end of the month. So let's flip that around. And since then, it's been much, much better because she's the one that actually now looks at me and says, hey, did you realize you paid this last month? Or did you realize you spent money on that? So I do think giving up control in my household has made things much, much better. I'm not sure what the question here is, but maybe you can say some comments around that.
Yeah, so I think that's also super interesting. We see that a lot. And basically, what you're doing by having one person solely responsible for the finances of the household is you are taking away the tracking ability. So people aren't able to accurately track costs or expenses. And so, like you said, that makes actual household income seem more like funny money, right? Because you don't have to ever incur the pain of payment. It's not something that you're doing, so you're unaware of it. And so it doesn't hurt to spend it all, which is a very dangerous situation, really, in terms of spending, if you're trying to curb spending at all. When you said that you're solely in charge of the finances, my mind went to this completely other finding where in general households tend to assign one person to finances and they'll make them the chief financial officer of the household. And what's not good about that is that it means only one person is in charge of those finances. And what happens to the person who's not the CFO is their financial literacy actually goes down because they're not involved in the daily financial decisions. They don't have to think through different financial choices. And it's almost like that skill atrophies in a way. And so you're not only turning money into more funny money, but you're also reducing the financial literacy of your partner or the person who's not in charge of the finances. And that ultimately also has detrimental effects. And it becomes perhaps a bigger deal when you consider if the two if the partner's separated. And so then one partner is kind of at a disadvantage. So whether that's due to death or divorce or whatever, it's this interesting finding around financial literacy and financial responsibility that I think is interesting and also super impactful, though not quite related to mental accounting.
One of the things that I've seen in my history in finance, especially when dealing with couples as it relates to their investments and their risk assessment, is one person's risk assessment is not another person's risk assessment. So, I mean, I think all this stuff is incredibly fascinating. I guess the question is, how do you fix it? And I know part of it is first you have to be aware of it to be able to fix it. But I'm aware of some of these things and I know I'm doing it, yet I still don't change my behavior. So how do you go about kind of fixing behavior?
That is such a good question and a really big question at the end of the day. You're right, awareness helps a lot, but we often are not able to de-bias ourselves or fix those biases or behavioral tendencies on our own. So the best way to help with decision making is usually focused around commitment devices. So you create constraints for yourself, knowing that you can't control, and I don't mean that in like a self-control way necessarily, but that you need these constraints or restraints to keep your behavior optimal as defined by yourself. There's also ways to help others, like setting up choice environments. So when you think about healthcare choice or retirement plan choice, it's much more effective to reduce the number of options to help people choose rather than overwhelm them with as many options as possible. And that also goes against economic theory, which says the more options, the better, because it's easier to match your preferences to one of the options. But in terms of getting people to actually select a plan, it's much better to reduce choices. So there's a lot that you can do to create choice environments that are more conducive or adaptable or flexible to these behavioral tendencies that we actually see. A lot of that can come in terms of how you are conveying choices to others. But I think there's also a big understanding that's necessary in that a lot of this is psychological. And so that means there's a fair amount that's emotion based. And risk, you probably don't want to get me started on risk because that's actually what my dissertation was about. But risk is a hugely emotional thing. And we tend, in terms of modeling and how we approach descriptions of risk, to not think of it that way. We think of it as, let's say, variance and expected value. But in reality, a lot of it is about fear and dread and, imagining bad outcomes makes things seem more risky. And so if we ignore the emotional component, it makes it very hard to help, maybe calibrate someone more to objective risk. So I think there's also kind of this embracing of emotion that needs to happen, which doesn't mean people need to start having emotional financial conversations, but they need to understand there's a huge component of emotion in terms of what they do financially.
We had a prior guest on whose entire practice is built around investor behavior. And when he talks about risks with his clients, he says the greatest risk is you running out of money. Whereas most people think of risk as my investment goes up or it goes down. So it's about kind of redirecting what the greater risks are. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yes. I think because of this emotional component, like for some reason, running out of money is more ambiguous. It's more long-term. It's kind of like climate change or I don't know, other things where it's like, it's not super emotional. It's not necessarily easy to imagine, but the concrete, like up, down in the short term is much easier to imagine, much more emotional or salient. And so people tend to focus on that and think of that as the risk, where in reality, like you're saying, the risk might be running out of money. So you have to kind of change the emotions from being about the short term to the long term. And so if you can transfer kind of, in a way, this is working within someone's psychology, but if you can kind of transfer the fear from the short term to the long term or from the narrow picture of someone's financial situation to the bigger picture, you're going to have people making better decisions in terms of the reality of the risk and the situation.
So Liz, I'm not sure if you've seen that hashtag girlmath.
Oh
I'm not
gosh, I
sure.
was hoping someone would bring this up.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's girls only. I think boys,
No.
I think men, I think all of us are guilty of this math. For those people who haven't looked at it, some of these posts are quite comical, and I'm certainly guilty of some of these maths. But is this something that you can, share your thoughts about?
So yes, I love this hashtag. I've seen many a TikTok video about this, and I also find them amazing. And I'm like, yes, I do that too. This is just, but every time I watch it, I'm like, well, first of all, this isn't just girl math, like you said, but I'm like, this is 100% mental accounting. Like all of this stuff that people are doing to justify spending, make it feel like they're getting money when they're not, just all of those things that they describe under that hashtag is 100% mental accounting, which everyone does. And so it's not exclusive to any gender or age group or any type of demographic variable. And I think it's really interesting to call attention to this and kind of force people to think about all of the weird things they do when it comes to spending money. And I just find it fascinating. And I love that there's this call out that's basically mental accounting, but because it's a neat, interesting hashtag, people pay more attention. So yes, I guess as academics, we failed to make things catchy and compelling. And so we should probably leave those to the influencers, as now is the case.
So I don't know whether to be incredibly discouraged or hopeful. The fact that I've got an academic on who understands every one of these topics, can internalize them all, yet still falls within the traps of some of them. I find this topic incredibly compelling and fascinating. Do you have any closing comments that you want to make?
I'll just respond to what you said in that, yes, I also find it in part fascinating that I know about all of this stuff, and I probably actually show a lot of these biases at a strength that may be higher than the general population. And part of that is that awareness can actually just make it worse. So a lot of times what happens is you're like, oh, I'm aware of all these things, so I don't do them, or I don't do them as badly as other people. It's actually much easier for us to be like, let's say Luke to be like, Keith, you're biased. The way you're spending your money, So it's much easier for us to point out these things in other people and not necessarily apply it to ourselves. And there's even, I forget who did it, but someone in the research basically said, like, the people who are experts in these behavioral biases actually tend to show them the most because they're overconfident in their ability to be vigilant about them and to correct them.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Liz, for joining Keith and myself today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. And
it was really fun.
Thanks for joining Convince Me in 15 Minutes. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe below. If you'd like to be our guest, please reach out to us on LinkedIn.